Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be cynical? Today, the word describes someone who is skeptical, sarcastic, hypocritical, or dishonest. Yet, its origin is much deeper and fascinating. There was a time when being called a cynic was a compliment, reserved for great men known for their virtues. Even Alexander the Great respected and wished to be associated with this philosophy. To understand the real meaning of cynicism and its transformation over time, we need to go back to ancient Greece. Picture a philosopher wandering the streets of Athens in broad daylight with a lit lantern. When someone stops him and asks what he is doing, he responds, "I am looking for an honest man." This man was Diogenes of Sinope, one of the most provocative philosophers of ancient Greece. But what did he mean by that? Original Cynicism was a movement that sought virtue through simplicity and self-sufficiency, rejecting the excesses and superficialities of society. Instead of pursuing wealth and status, Cynics preached a life of authenticity and freedom. They used sarcasm, humor, and even a certain innocence to challenge and provoke what they considered absurd or meaningless. Led by figures like Antisthenes and Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynics lived in ways many would consider extreme. They were known for their simple life, often compared to that of dogs, so much so that the term cynic comes from the Greek kynikos, meaning like a dog. When I encountered cynical philosophy, I was immediately fascinated, perhaps because of its touch of humor or its clear way of expressing itself. Probably because I realized how current the questions of the Cynics are and how applying this philosophy in modern life makes sense, providing clarity of ideas and significant transformation. Let's explore together. Cynicism, the philosophy of the mad dog. Once, Diogenes saw a boy drinking water with his hands and immediately threw away his bowl, saying, "If a boy can drink with his hands, I don't need this bowl." For the Cynics, simplicity was the key to happiness. They believed that by reducing their needs to the minimum, they could achieve true freedom. Cynics were not just philosophers who spoke about their ideas. They lived their philosophies intensely and radically. For them, true virtue could only be achieved through simplicity and the rejection of material goods and social conventions. But how did this work in practice? They believed that happiness and freedom came from living in harmony with nature, detached from all possessions and worldly concerns. They saw society as corrupt and consumerist, and its achievements, like wealth, status, and power, were seen as obstacles to a virtuous life. Rather than worrying about others' opinions, they focused on being authentic and self-sufficient. The comparison with dogs was no coincidence. Like dogs, Cynics lived on the streets, without modesty, without material possessions, and without caring what others thought of them. This simple and unadorned life was a symbol of their rejection of social norms and their search for true freedom. For Cynics, the most basic and natural needs should not be a source of shame. Eating in public, sleeping anywhere, and even other physiological needs were seen as normal and acceptable. They believed that true morality came from living according to nature, not from the rules imposed by society. Diogenes of Sinope, one of the most famous Cynics, took this philosophy to the extreme. He lived in a barrel, owned only a staff, a lantern, and a sack, and made poverty his greatest virtue. For Diogenes, all artificial achievements of society were incompatible with happiness and morality. To understand how Diogenes became such an iconic figure of cynicism, we must first know Antisthenes, the precursor of this philosophical current. Socrates, the great questioner of Athens, never wrote a line, but his ideas changed the world. Among his many disciples was Antisthenes, who was deeply impressed by the teachings of Socrates. Antisthenes founded his own school and became the precursor of Cynicism. He argued that virtue was sufficient to achieve happiness and that true wealth came from self-sufficiency and disdain for material pleasures. Antisthenes taught that life should be lived according to nature and that social conventions were artificial and unnecessary. For him, happiness did not depend on external possessions, but on a virtuous and simple life. His radical philosophy challenged the incessant pursuit of wealth and status, which he saw as distractions from the true essence of life. His ideas deeply influenced Diogenes, who decided to take this philosophy to the extreme. Diogenes of Sinope took these ideas and turned them into a radical way of living. He is, without doubt, the most emblematic figure of Cynicism and lived so extremely that his stories and anecdotes continue to fascinate to this day. Diogenes was born in Sinope, a city on the coast of the Black Sea, but eventually moved to Athens, where he began to follow the ideas of Antisthenes. But Diogenes was not an ordinary follower. He decided to take philosophy to its extreme, living in a way that defied all social conventions. Diogenes was known for his provocations. He had no respect for the great philosophers of the time, especially Plato. In a famous anecdote, Plato defined man as a featherless biped, and Diogenes, in response, plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy, saying, "Here is Plato's man." This type of provocation was typical of Diogenes, who saw Plato's philosophy as elitist and disconnected from reality. His fame grew so much that even Alexander the Great, the most important man of the time, came to visit him. Diogenes was lying on the ground, soaking up the sun. Alexander approached and asked Diogenes, "Can I offer you anything? What would you like?" And Diogenes simply responded, "Anything? Then get out of my sun." This straightforward and courageous reply impressed Alexander, who, knowing Diogenes' entire philosophy, would have said, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes." No one can disagree that Diogenes was truly half-mad, but in an era when Aristotle, Plato, and all the great thinkers defended slavery, it was this madman who was totally opposed to it. Perhaps by irony of fate, Diogenes himself ended up being captured by pirates to be sold as a slave. However, this did not shake him. During the trip to the auction, the prisoners barely received enough food to survive. Diogenes, with his usual cunning, caught the pirates' attention and said, "When you capture a pig or a cow to sell, you feed them well so that they stay healthy and valuable. But when you capture a human being, the noblest of animals, you let them starve until they have no value at all." Convinced by his logic, the pirates began to feed the prisoners better. At the auction, when asked about his skills, Diogenes declared, "My specialty is governing men." Then he pointed to a visibly wealthy man in the audience and said, "Sell me to that man there. He looks like he needs a master." The man, named Xeniades, recognized Diogenes' wisdom and bought him. Soon, getting to know Diogenes better and realizing his wisdom, he entrusted him with the administration of his house and the education of his children. The legacy of Diogenes goes beyond his personal stories and provocations. His ideas and attitudes left a lasting mark on philosophy and society. While the original Cynics were often ridiculed for their extreme lifestyle, their ideas influenced many later philosophical currents and continue to resonate to this day. One of the major influences of Cynicism was the famous Stoicism. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, was a disciple of Crates of Thebes, who in turn was a disciple of Diogenes. Imagine a very radical philosophical grandfather, whose ideas shape the thoughts of the grandson, who in turn gives them a more palatable touch for the audience. The Stoics adopted many cynical ideas, such as self-sufficiency, simplicity, and rejection of material goods, but developed these ideas in a way that was more accessible and acceptable to society at the time. And it didn't stop there. Cynicism also left its mark on early Christian thought. Many early Christians lived in communities that practiced voluntary poverty and rejection of material goods. Sounds familiar, right? The idea of living according to nature and rejecting social conventions also found resonance in many religious movements throughout history. Who would have thought that Diogenes and his friends would influence even the formation of religious communities? However, the word cynic underwent a significant transformation over the centuries. In the 2nd century AD, the writer Lucian of Samosata criticized the self-proclaimed cynics of his time, who preached the teachings of Diogenes but lived oppositely. Imagine someone who preaches material detachment but lives in a mansion. Over time, the word cynic began to be associated with a negative and disbelieving attitude, far from its original meaning. This transformation was even more pronounced during the Renaissance and the Reformation, when the term cynic began to be used to describe people who were seen as hypocrites or dishonest. Today, calling someone a cynic usually implies that the person is bitter and suspicious of others' intentions. But despite this distortion, cynical philosophy still has much to offer. Its ideas about self-sufficiency, simplicity, and rejection of social conventions are more relevant than ever in a world that often values materialism and superficiality. The courage to question the status quo and live according to one's own principles is a lasting legacy of the Cynics. Although we live in a world very different from that of ancient Greece, the teachings of the Cynics can still be applied in practical and meaningful ways today. The essence of Cynicism, self-sufficiency, simplicity, and rejection of social conventions can help us navigate an increasingly complex and materialistic world. One of the main teachings of the Cynics is self-sufficiency. In a world where we depend so much on technology and complex economic systems, finding ways to be more self-sufficient can be extremely liberating. This may include practical skills such as growing food, doing basic home repairs, or even learning to meditate to cultivate inner peace. Simplicity is another central value of Cynicism. Living simply and detached from material goods can help us focus on what really matters. Instead of seeking happiness in possessions and status, we can find joy in small things and meaningful relationships. This does not mean that we need to live like Diogenes in a barrel, but we can adopt a minimalist mindset that prioritizes the essential. Rejecting social conventions can also be a powerful way to live according to the teachings of Cynics. In a world where we are often pressured to follow certain paths to success and happiness, having the courage to question and challenge these norms can help us find our own truth. This may mean choosing a career that we truly love, even if it is not the most lucrative, or deciding to live in a way that reflects our deepest values. However, living according to cynical principles is not without challenges. In a society that values materialism and conformism, it can be difficult to stand out and follow a different path. This requires courage, resilience, and a strong conviction that true happiness comes from living according to our own values. By applying the teachings of Cynics in the modern world, we can find ways to live more authentically and meaningfully. We need the courage of Diogenes to question social norms and the conviction of Antisthenes to defend virtue as the path to true happiness. We need to learn to value what is truly important and to reject what is superficial and artificial. In a world that often values materialism and superficiality, cynical philosophy offers us a refreshing and necessary perspective. The courage to question the status quo, to live according to our own principles, and to seek true happiness in simplicity and self-sufficiency is a lasting legacy of the Cynics. More than ever, we need a new cynicism. This new cynicism is not about contempt or bitterness. It is about authenticity, courage, and freedom. It is about living according to our deepest values and not being a slave to others' expectations. It is about finding true happiness in a life lived according to nature. I invite you to reflect on your own life and choices. Where can you apply the teachings of Cynicism? How can you live more authentically and meaningfully? The pursuit of a true and authentic life is an ongoing journey, and the Cynics offer us a valuable compass on this journey. If this video made you reflect at any moment, like the video, comment below and let me know your thoughts. Thank you for your support, and remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.